Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers, and welcome to another installment of this landscape material series. And in today's episode we're going to add a third variation technique to the landscape, which allows us to blend two textures in a layer. Let's get straight into it. Now we've already added two variation techniques to our landscape. We first did a color variation, so we used the noise mask to vary the shading of the texture on a layer, and then we also put in a tiling variation which rotated and scaled the textures so they didn't repeat into the distance. So this third and final variation technique is going to do texture variation, so within a layer. So instead of having the same texture here all the way in, say, the ground layer, we can take another layer or another material and then mix that in. And we'll be using very similar technique, using the noise mask to blend between the different textures. So let's get going on that. If we go into our content browser and choose our material folder, material functions, we'll create a new material function for this. So right click material, material function, and I'm going to call it mf_texture variation. And then open that up. And we'll have two inputs for our texture variation. So if you right click and do input, the first one will be, we'll just call it first material. It will be a type of material attributes, and we won't have any preview for that. So you can just now take that, Control D to duplicate it, and we'll call this next input second material. And just double check that it is a material attributes type as well. And then our output we'll call texture variation material. And now what we need to do is create a mask and then blend these two attributes together. And this is very, very similar to what we've done with the color variation layer. So let's first of all take our landscape coordinates and then a divide. And we'll put in our first parameter, so S on the keyboard and left click, and we'll call this texture variation tiling size. And we'll do a default value, just something different from the other variations you've done. So just pick a random number. I'll do 577 here. And then I will plug that into the divide. And so that's our tiling size. We then need a texture sample. And this will be our usual shared wrap. And the texture we want is the one we've used throughout this series, our landscape noise. And from there, we then want to have a couple of options with the intensity and contrast. So again, very similar to what we did in the color variation. So let's drag out of here, do a cheap contrast, and again we'll provide a control for that. So take our texture variation tiling size, duplicate it with Control D, and I'm going to call this texture variation contrast. Default value of 1, and plug that into the contrast. Next thing we need to do is to have an intensity control. So we'll do a multiply, and we'll now have a duplicate this and have a texture variation intensity control. And for this, I want this to be a value between 0 and 1. So let's put it half at the moment. So we want it to either be fully including the new texture, or no, none of the new texture, or somewhere in between. So in order to make sure this value stays between 0 and 1, we can use our old friend, the saturate node, which clamps the value between 0 and 1. And then we can then plug that into the multiply. And that is now our mask for the texture variation. So let's select all those nodes, C for comment, and I'll call it noise mask. And now we can use that mask to blend between these two materials. So let's just move these over a little bit. And the way we blend between these is we use blend material attributes. So right click, blend material attributes, and we can plug in our first material, our second material, and then this noise mask is the alpha. And then we can plug that into the output. But let's add one final parameter, a switch, to allow us to switch this on and off. So right click and do a static switch parameter. And we'll call this add landscape texture variation. And if it's true, we're going to take the output of the mix and then plug that on into the output. But if it's false, we want to take just that first material on its own. So let's just move that up and move this up and plug this into the false, just like that. And we'll leave the default value as false so that it's not added by default. All right, do save. Hopefully you won't get any errors here. And what we now need to do is we need to add this new material function into the master material. So go back to your master material. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add it into the ground layer. Actually, before I do that, let's set up the parameter order. If you look over in the material instance, we've got this landscape color variation section that looks very similar. We've got add color variation and then the intensity, contrast, and tiling size. So let's set up a new group for landscape texture variation and we'll have them in the same order. So back to your material function and we'll start off with the static switch parameter, and over in the group I'm going to call it landscape texture variation, and I'll make that priority 1. Then we will select the intensity, the same group, but priority 2. Then the contrast, assign it to the group, priority 3. And finally, the tiling size, landscape texture variation group, priority 4. Okay, so then when we add it into the master material, it should look very much like this color variation, but in a different group. So now save and apply, come back to auto landscape. I'm just going to add it to the ground layer on this material. If you wanted to add it to the other layers, you would have to add extra parameters and inputs coming in so that you could vary them for each layer, but it's probably fine just to have it in the ground layer on this particular master material. So I'm going to create a little bit of space after MF puddles, between the create layer and the puddle function. Then if we open up our material functions in the content browser, I will drag in the texture variation and we will plug our output from create layer into the first material and then plug the output into the input of puddles. And now we just need to add in a second material. So it's up to you which material layer you want to add in here. You can create a separate layer that you want to add in here. I'm just going to use the mid-high material, the one we use for our sort of path and soil. But you've got options there. So let's just use our named reroute for mid-high material, and I will plug that into the second one. And we should be ready for our first test. So save and apply here. Let's go back to the main landscape. And you can see in our material instance, we now have this new section. landscape texture variation with a switch that hasn't been turned off yet, or turned on yet, I should say. So let's select that. And let me just sort of look down, so we're looking on the ground in more detail. And at the moment, if we do let's select that on, and then after a second for it to recompile the shader, you can see that there are sections here where it is the mid-high layer, just over there in the top right, and there are sections where it's the original stone landscape. So let's switch all the other ones on. And let's play around with some of these values. So if I make the texture variation intensity 1, now you can see that those stone path textures are much more visible in that layer, but that's way too much. If you make the texture variation intensity 0, it goes back to the original textures with no visibility of the second texture. So now we can play around with some of the other values. Let's put it 0.5 again to get a little bit of that. It'll maybe a bit more, 0.7. Okay, so we see a little bit more of that. And now if I zoom back out a bit, we can play around with the tile size. If I make the tile size bigger, you can see that it's larger patches of the second texture. If I make it small, it's smaller patches of the texture there. And then the contrasts makes it a sort of smoother blend. So if I do 0, it smooths the transition between where one texture appears and the other texture appears. So let's go back to our original value of 577. And if I go into play mode, you can see that as I go around, there are patches where there are those big stones. And then let's go over here. There's the stones, and now here is a section where it's more of just the regular sort of small gravel of the high path. And if you're wondering whether displacement will still work, yeah, that'll all work fine. Let's show that. So we've got, let's come out of play mode. We've got displacement on our ground texture here. We haven't got it on the mid-high layer, although we could add it on there. So let's go into the material instance. I've got, if I go up to the ground layer, you'll see I've got add displacement on, but I haven't actually got the tessellation switch on. So let's go down to the material property overrides where it says enable tessellation, and let's switch that on. And after a second, you can see that I've now got the displacement on that, but it's only displacing the texture at the ground layer. We haven't got it switched on for the other one, but it still works fine. Again, go into play mode, and we can run around between those different sections. And this, again, nicely breaks up sections where it's displaced and sections where there's a small amount of displacement coming through because of the blend between it. So I hope you've found it useful today. We now have 3 techniques for variation on our layer. We have the color variation, we have the tiling variation, the rotation and scale, and now we have the ability to mix textures. And you can use this in any way you see fit. We've just mixed 2 textures together. Nothing to stop you mixing multiple textures. Also, nothing stopping you adding this to other layers as you wish. So stay tuned for the next one. We've got about 4, maybe 5 more videos to come in this series before I wrap it up. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.